Though video games are the most lucrative form of entertainment media in the world, with an annual revenue now more than movies and music combined, there are still a great many people who just simply have no interest in picking up a controller. I know, weird, right? In fact, it's actually quite tough for gamers to even think about it, but on the other side of the fence, there are those who simply just don't get the appeal of gaming and therefore possess no knowledge of how the industry operates or how players engage within the medium. And that's not a knock against non-gamers, of course, simply that their interests lie elsewhere. And on the other side, we gamers just naturally take these core tenets of the industry just for granted. And so, from the cutting-edge mechanics of modern games to the biggest issues facing the industry today, the immersive potential of the medium and everything in between, these are the highs and lows of video games that non-gamers just simply do not understand. So let's go through 10 of them today, shall we? As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 things non-gamers don't understand about gaming. Number 10. Modern video games are alive. Though non-gamers can obviously appreciate that video games are an interactive medium, many don't understand quite how the relationship between player and game can unfold in our ever-evolving present. The very nature of gaming in 2020 means that rather than players just coming to the end of a game, more titles than ever are constantly transforming as part of the current boom in live service business models. In recent years, games such as Destiny, The Division, Fortnite, and so on have flourished on the promises of their fluidity, where new content is constantly delivered to players to ensure the experience is never static, or dare one say, finished. The obvious incentive is to keep players coming back day after day through sheer force of habit, and as a result, games are kept alive by the participation and investment of their community, namely the purchase of in-game cosmetics and other little bits and bobs through microtransactions. And as such, live service games can also technically die if their community abandons them, but that's a prospect that might be especially tough for non-gamers to wrap their heads around. Indeed, we enter into this strange scenario where paying your upfront fee to play a game is actually no guarantee that you'll be able to play it forever, as perhaps was most brutally proven by Gearbox's online FPS Battleborn, which was destroyed by Overwatch in the weeks following its release, and it's effectively now dead. Number 9. Crunch culture is a major problem in the industry. If you're not part of the gaming bubble, it's easy to underestimate the ludicrous amount of work that goes into making even a terrible game. Hundreds of employees work on them at any one time. And it's not always a pleasant experience, because what we're really talking about here is crunch, the means through which dev team employees are invited to work up to 80 hours per week to complete games before release, often without sufficient compensation. Rockstar Games were raked over the coals shortly before the release of Red Dead Redemption 2 regarding their notoriously demanding working conditions. Yet to outsiders, it's likely just assumed that game dev employees are all working relatively well-paid jobs in cushy offices and just having a chill time. But in fact, the absurd man-hours that go into creating maps, characters, game logic, animation, voiceovers, cinematic menus, and so on absolutely cannot be downplayed. Though crunch is a well-known issue in gamer circles, it's sadly still struggling to pick up sufficient attention within the mainstream. Number 8. Representation means more than in any other art form. It's certainly been refreshing to see the media as a whole embrace the spirit of representation over the last few years, with a tendency towards greater inclusivity for women, persons of color, the LGBTQ community, and minority groups as a whole. But representation is never more meaningful an issue than it is within the gaming world, because of one major reason: interactivity. While it's undeniably important for people to see people like themselves in movies and on TV, the fact that games literally allow players to take control of a character for dozens, if not hundreds of hours, makes inclusion so much more important and resonant. Now, this isn't to say that every game should have customizable characters, but instead that games with custom protagonists should allow for anything possible in terms of gender, skin color, sexual preferences, and so on. It's an argument which non-gamers might perceive as trivial in the grand scheme of things. But giving players the ability to create themselves down to the finest detail, no matter the characteristics, and insert themselves into an expansive world for hours on end is the ultimate form of self-actualization in media. It's something that movies, TV, books, they just can't compete with, yet for those who've never picked up a game before, it's easily missed. Number 7. Video games are good for the brain. in moderation. Even in a contemporary society where video games are generally accepted by the mainstream, it's still of the opinion that many games are, above all else, just mind-numbing and time-wasting. But of course, as anyone who's ever picked up a controller in their life knows, the vast majority of video games exercise mental stimulation, whether testing, coordination, or more complex problem-solving. Though there are absolutely games which are just played simply to mindlessly unwind after a tough day at the office, scientific studies are increasingly supporting the notion that video games can aid long-term mental acuity throughout a person's life. Now, moderation is the key though, of course, as playing anything to excess will not be helpful for a person's mental well-being, but the many non-gamers who consider an evening of gaming comparable to passing out in front of the TV watching a mindless reality show, well, they're totally wrong. Number 6, the limitations of the pause button. Anyone who's been gaming long enough will eventually be asked by a parent or significant other, can't you just pause the bloody game? Presuming that all games can just somehow be frozen in place with the press of a button when your presence is required elsewhere. Now, in the good old days, most video games didn't even allow the player to pause cutscenes. And though this has widely been remedied in the last decade or so, there's been a huge uptick in always online games, meaning that the pause button definitely has its limitations. Trying to explain this to non-gamers can be a frequent source of frustration, because it typically requires giving them a long-winded explanation about other players being actual people, how the infrastructure of online play actually operates, and how likely you'll just be kicked or punished for leaving the game because it's considered that you are idle. And even if you're patient enough to calmly explain all of this, there's a fair chance that you'll be met with a response along the likes of, "So, it's just a game. Well, you know what? Boo, boo, the crowd hates that, boo." Number 5, watching other people play games is fun. One of the most prominent sources of bafflement among non-gamers today is the prevalence of players watching other people play video games on platforms such as YouTube, Twitch, and so on. This is primarily in the form of Let's Plays, where players record themselves playing games, usually complete with their own audio commentary and video accompaniment. Now, on the surface, many can't understand the utility of watching somebody else play a game when you can just play the game yourself. But this entirely discounts several important things. Firstly, the personality of these people goes a long way here. Secondly, it's a neat way to learn about new games and possibly even experience games that you don't necessarily want to play yourself. I mean, for example, I love horror games, but what if you didn't like horror games, but you enjoyed the concept of watching people play it through a kind of medium of safety? I totally understand that. The people who don't play, well, they don't. And there's also a social aspect of connecting with Twitch streamers and people like that, because you're part of a community all chiming in where they're playing. In fact, we stream here on WhatCulture Gaming every Tuesday and Thursday, and seeing the people pop up and give their support and spread messages of joy or adoration or basically scream at us for doing things incredibly wrong, that's part and parcel of the entertainment. And I wouldn't change it for the world, because I love being able to see people connect with us in real time. That's fantastic. But people who don't play, well, they just simply see it as just a waste of time. Number 4, interactivity enhances emotional investment. Even in 2020, there are still many people who find the prospect of emotionally engaging with a video game, well, laughable, that the human element simply isn't sufficient enough to generate such a response. And while it is fair to say that most video games are still lagging behind books, movies, and TV when it comes to this it's also important to appreciate that the uniquely immersive potential of gaming can take it to emotional heights that these other media can't even begin to imagine. Just consider The Last of Us, a game with one of the greatest stories and richest cast of characters video games has ever seen. Now, given that we, as players, spend around 15 hours or so in this world fighting for survival ourselves, the sense of investment is so much greater than had we just been watching this drama unfold over the course of a TV series. Yet, for those who've never played a video game, it is difficult to appreciate the added involvement that comes with being an actual physical component of the storytelling itself. Number 3, violent video games relieve stress, but do not make people violent. Now, this debate about the appeal of violent video games will exist as long as video games themselves do, and if you're a non-gamer, it is tough to see why people like to play gory shoot-'em-ups and frightening games. And the mass media is likely to blame these types of titles for this major misconception that violent video games make people violent and are effectively training people to commit such acts in real life. Now, though this dialogue has thankfully quieted down in recent years as gaming has become more mainstream, for non-gamers, the use of violent video games still remains mystifying. In reality, the truth is that brutally violent video games like Doom and Grand Theft Auto are fantastic for blowing off steam. It doesn't mean that you wish to commit such acts in real life, but simply that tension and stress can be relieved with the adrenaline-soaked safety of a video game environment. Yet on the flip side of video games as stress relief, we've certainly all played video games which totally made us flip our lids. Because, number 2, great games can still be annoying. There's no denying that, at one point or another, all gamers have found themselves steeped in an inconsolable rage, infuriated that a certain mission or boss just keeps kicking our ass. But just because a game makes you swear like a sailor and has possibly made you even rage quit on occasion, that doesn't mean that the game is bad. And I know that that's a very strange concept for non-gamers to understand, because why would you stick with anything that's difficult and making you angry? And the response being, because it's good. And not all games are supposed to be relaxing. Anyone who's played anything from Software can understand the intense annoyance of a tricky boss, but then also the utter elation that comes with finally figuring things out. The push and pull of despair and victory is exactly what makes the Dark Souls games what they are, and without it, they just wouldn't be the same. As much as players might lose their cool in the moment, it doesn't reflect their overall opinion of that game. And granted, some games are cheap and difficult for their own sake, but when they're tough but fair, it's just part of the joyous, painstaking experience. And number 1, the stress of the backlog. Only long-time gamers can truly appreciate the notion of a video game backlog and the stress that definitely comes with it. To outsiders, gaming is indeed supposed to be a sanctuary of relaxation, but there's no denying the pressure that players feel when their backlog of incomplete games starts mounting up. If you mention this problem to non-gamers, they'll typically ask why your supposedly fun hobby is starting to sound like a job and boils down to nothing but a checklist of tasks that needs to be dispassionately completed. Well, the stress basically boils down to 2 fears: wasting money on a game that you'll never start or finish playing, and FOMO, from never getting around to playing a supposed masterpiece that's been sitting on your Steam library for 3 bloody years. The more enlightened among us are able to reconcile the backlog by appreciating that not all games need to be finished in order to have their value realized, and that there's no accounting for what game that you'll be in the mood to play on any given day. But for those who don't play games, it must seem like a completely ridiculous issue to have, an embarrassment of riches. Well, you know what? Sometimes ignorance is bliss in this case, because my God, my library, it haunts me. It haunts me. And there we go, my friends. Those were 10 things that non-gamers don't understand about gaming. I hope that you enjoyed that, my friends, and please let me know what you thought about it down in the comments section below. If you want to chat to me further about anything to do with video games or anything else, you can do so over on Twitter at RetroJ0, or you can swing by Live and Let's Dice, as my personal gaming channel where I stream every Wednesday and Sunday. But before I go, I just want to say one thing. We detailed today about things where one group of people couldn't get the message across to other people, and you know what? We can definitely apply that to our mental health. Because sometimes it can be a very difficult conversation to have with people who might not be experiencing the same thing or even understand. I promise you, it can be very difficult to open up those conversations, but they are worthwhile. And remember, friends, family, and professionals in the support industry, they want you to do well. They care about you. So as difficult as it might be, letting people in on the problems that are going on within your own life, I promise you that they will try their best to help. Give them time, give them space, give yourself some love, and try and start those dialogues. As always, I've been Jules. You have been awesome. Never forget that. And I'll speak to you soon. Bye.